Welcome to the Irish Occupational Therapy Podcast. This series, Series 3, is focused on using occupational therapy wisdom to support parents with their child's development. So we'll be exploring key areas such as sleep, feeding, toileting, play and communication with insights from experts in occupational therapy and other fields.
Our goal is to normalise the challenges of parenting and provide practical tips and advice. You'll hear from dedicated professionals who will share their expertise and personal experiences to help you navigate the complexities of raising children.
Welcome back to the Irish Occupational Therapy Podcast Parenting Series. We're absolutely delighted to talk to, a speech and language specialist, but also speech and language queen, Sarah Kelly from Play Easy today. Sarah's going to talk to us about communication and the importance of that and the value of that. And we're absolutely thrilled to have her expertise. Sarah, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much for having me along. I'm delighted.
So communication as an occupation, it's really important for parents and for children, but can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. Just tell us a little bit about you and your role in relation to communication and children and parents.
Yeah, of course. So as you mentioned, I'm a speech and language therapist. I'm also a mum first and foremost, and I think that's important as well. And, I work to support parents to develop the child's communication, and there are a huge amount of different areas that we can support them with. And I think one of the big things is really giving parents the tools and strategies to go away and support their child. And that's about meeting the child where they're at. And of course, really looking at, where are the child's interests and trying to tap into that as much as possible. I always say that we can map language onto anything a child is interested in, but sometimes it's really finding that area of interest. Some children that we work with are maybe not so interested in toys, and that's okay. It's about finding what they like. Do they like to transfer objects? Do they like to see objects fall from a height? And how can we map language and communication into that?
What about some of your go-to strategies, Sarah, in therapy sessions? What are some of the most popular ways of engaging and playing with the child? What's your go-to resources? And
Aidan, well, the first thing is to get that connection going. So, when a child comes in for therapy, sometimes we do spend a lot of time just trying to connect and engage with the child, because if we don't have that connection, it makes everything else really difficult. And, there's no absolute set toys or equipment that we can use. And that's a really common question that parents will say to me, like, what will I buy to support my child's speech and language development? And the most important thing you can do is, first of all, connect with the child and then see and notice what they're interested in. Just thinking, for example, my own son, my middle son, he's quite busy. He wouldn't be great for that tabletop work. He seeks a lot of movement. But say, for instance, he has an interest in dinosaurs. We can take dinosaurs and pretty much map language into everything. So we can think about how they feel, how they look, their size, their noises. We can explore different, where do they live? We can map on questions. So I suppose it's really about connection first and then following the child's interests and their lead. And that can be difficult because I think as parents, we often think that play should look like a certain way, but it's not the case. If a child isn't interested in movement, we can map language onto that, so even a simple ready, steady, go, holding the child and letting them go and chasing after them, teaching body parts by tickling or squeezing them. So I think sometimes it's been a little bit imaginative and just maybe not thinking that play needs to look a certain way.
Curiosity, anticipation, looking out for all of those opportunities to create.
Yeah. And the most important thing, I suppose, is when you think, most parents will say to me, oh, they don't have words, that maybe that's the kind of most obvious thing. And I always call that the tip of the iceberg. It's the kind of thing that you can really see, but it's all the underlying skills that are really important. Like, how did they take their turn? How did they have, what's their joint attention like? Do they anticipate? And if you think about communication is a back and forth reciprocal interaction. And I always describe that as like a game of tennis. So you take a turn and they take a turn. Now, If they're not using words, that doesn't matter. Is their turn an anticipatory body movement? Is it a raise of their eyebrows? Is it like a little bit of a posturing in their mouth? Or is it a noise? So their turn doesn't need to be verbal, but you really need to get used to interpreting your child's turn. And that's probably one of the biggest things that we have to kind of work on, because parents will say, but it's not a word, but that's not what it's about. It's about them taking their turn in that reciprocal nature. And even like, I've got a 3-month-old baby at the moment, I'm speaking to him, but then I'm pausing, and I'm a really big pause, and I'm waiting. What does he do to communicate to me that he wants me to keep this interaction going? And that's really what builds the architecture in the brain for language.
Yeah. And it can be simple things. Like I watched a video of you recently on your page, Sarah, just playing peekaboo with a very inviting little sheer scarf. So again, going back to simple things, not overcomplicating things, and observing and just taking a step back to see what is the child intrinsically motivated in.
Yes.
I think it's really helpful to think about it, communication rather than language and speech, because I think in my head, I think, communication is words. And the way that you've described that, it's so much more than that. So even if a child doesn't have words, we're still looking at how to communicate. But I suppose as parents, maybe words are the easiest way for us to recognize when there might be a bit of a problem. We kind of go to, that they're not talking. Are there other kind of things that parents can kind of keep an eye out for, or that might be kind of signs of communication challenges or disorders?
Yeah. So even like things that we look out for are, responding to their name and following little instructions for you without that gesture and that cue, because we do a lot of that very naturally. But one of the big things that we look for is the use of gesture. So the use of gesture is really a prerequisite for language development. So that imitation of gesture and action. So if you think about it, children learn by imitating. They learn by copying, and they learn by watching you. There are 2 types of imitation. So the first type of imitation is imitation of action on an object. So that is like if you pick up a new toy and you model how to use it, they join in and copy you. But the other type of imitation, and that predicts play, but the imitation of gesture and action predicts language development. So that's one of the big ones that we work on. And if a child is not using those words, we go back and look at their gestures. But also babbling is a really important one. Those noises, like, are they quiet or are they exploring with their mouth? And, if they're not, then we're thinking, like, do we need to look at their hearing? Are they understanding? It is often that, as you said, people really think about words, but there's a lot more to that. And we do look at their play as well. Like, play is the work of the child. That is how a child learns. And all therapy sessions should look like a nice play activity. It shouldn't look really structured. But we do look at how a child is playing as well, just to look in and see, what are they interested in? Are they developing pretend play? Have they got constructive play? Are they doing some problem solving in their play? So their play will really tell us a lot about them.
I think that's a key point as we learn more about neurodiversity, isn't it? And trying to embrace a affirming approach in therapy. Yes. So validating any form of communication, whether it's a gesture, a facial expression, whether the child is using vocalizations to ask for something, that we appreciate that and respond to that. Years ago, it would have been where we had to use pecs maybe, or another type of
eye contact. We were, we worked for eye contact, we waited for eye contact, and now we accept that, if eye contact is not their preferred mode of communication, that's absolutely fine. We don't need them to look at us to show that they're listening. They may show they're listening to us in other ways.
You mentioned play there and the importance of play. And I'm wondering, from a parent's perspective, is there anything specifically that they should be aiming to incorporate in their play with a child? Aideen mentioned peekaboo there earlier, and I suppose that might change throughout the age ranges. But what can parents do differently in their play to support communication and language?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. First of all, I would say, sit back and watch your child before you dive right in, because like I said, for example, you might have, say, a shape sorter, and your opinion of that shape sorter is that you should slot the shapes into the spaces, but your child comes at it in a different way, and they like to build the shapes or stack them on top of each other, or they like to bind them together. So I always say, instead of jumping in what you want to do, stop and watch them first and meet them where they're at. You know, children are more likely to join in with you when you follow their lead, because they feel like they've been validated in what they're doing. Whereas if you come in and change the direction of that, they might actually opt out and move on to something else. So I always say that, and copy them first. And if sometimes when you copy them, they'll stop and watch you, and then they'll start to copy you later. And then you get that copying going, but you're also getting that back and forth reciprocal nature of communication in your play. Get face-to-face as much as you can. If you've got a child that doesn't like face-to-face, that's absolutely fine. You know, we always, talk about respecting that and things like that. But if you can, and they'll allow it, get face-to-face, because when they look up at you, then they can see your facial expressions. They can see the way your mouth is moving. Like toys that have lights and music are really, really engaging for little ones. But just be mindful that they often take away from the interaction with you. So children need to be able to play with people before playing with toys. So that people play is really important. And sometimes those light up flashing toys really capture the interest of the child, and it gets in the way of your interaction. Now, if your child really likes them, that's absolutely fine. But try and find other activities that you can get that people play going. And things like tickles and peekaboo and chasing are really lovely examples, because kids generally like that. Or big tight squeezes, or rolling them up in a duvet or a blanket, because then what's happening is you're really the center of that engagement. Just be mindful as well when you're interacting with your child is be mindful of your use of questions. We often go in with like, what's that? What are you doing? And if you can change your questions into comments, look at those blocks. So cool. You're building. Bang, 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 bang. So instead of asking the questions, that you use comments instead, because it's unlikely that a child is going to be able to answer those questions. That's a really important one. And also, pausing for their turn. So again, when we're thinking about that back and forth reciprocal nature, we're often really good, and parents are really good at doing lots of modeling, but they don't give their child a chance. And sometimes they need a really long pause until it feels uncomfortable before they'll take their turn, because they're processing the language, they're thinking about their motor movements, they're thinking about the activity in the toy. So it's really about giving your child big pauses in the interaction to see if they want to join in. And if they don't, that's fine, you move on. It's not that you must wait for them to do something, but it's just allowing them their turn when they can have it.
They're great practical tips. And I love how you talk there about bringing a sensory element into play. It's nearly doing two things at once there. You're having the connection, engagement, and a meaningful input, I suppose.
Yeah.
I want to feel really good, and at a body level with the child as well. Sarah, can we talk about everyday routines, maybe in a family's home? And let's say a child has difficulty with understanding, so the receptive language, they have differences in that area. What practical strategies could we share for parents to support their children? So let's say it's things like maybe getting ready for the bath, or evening wind down routines, and their child has difficulties with the instructions.
Well, I think they're kind of two kind of separate questions in a way. So the everyday activities is a brilliant one. And it's one I try and always give parents strategies and ideas for, because it's easy to map the language on or map the strategies onto. And things like bath time, meal time, getting dressed in the morning, packing your bag, going in the car, they're really nice opportunities for language development. One, because they're quite repetitive in nature. So you often do the same thing each time, and it makes that language very kind of sticky, as I call it, because it's very applicable. It's one of the reasons why I don't love flashcards. And I feel like there's often a misconception that we need to get children engaging in flashcards. Now, if your child has an interest in flashcards, I always say follow that, and of course join in with that. But my experience is that children are not that motivated and interested in them. And why? Because they're a flat piece of paper. But if you think about showing your child a picture of a bath versus putting them in the bath, they get all the senses to experience what the bath feels like. They get to feel the difference between hot and cold temperatures. They get to splash. So as you're modeling these concepts for language, they are experiencing them in their body as well. So washing their body parts, they get to feel their body part, splashing the water, and it makes that language really, really functional. And then thinking about, using what we call fun sounds or symbolic sounds in those activities. So splashing the bath, splash, 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 splash. It's a very like rhythmic kind of sound to it, when you're eating food, hot. So you're adding all those symbolic sounds that really makes it functional. So I absolutely love strategies where you can map them into your everyday activities. And in terms of the following instructions piece, what I always say is, call your child's name or alert them in some way first. So like that might be a gentle touch on the shoulder. If they'll tolerate, if your child tolerates light touch, you have to be aware of what your child is okay with. For my son, he likes really firm pressure. So I'd have to give him almost a squeeze on the shoulder to alert him, or calling their name or getting face to face with them before you give them an instruction. Give them the instruction, but think about simplifying it. So maybe chunking it. So, first we're going to take our clothes off, and then you do that piece of it. And then we're going to get into the bath. And then, repeat it if you need to. But I always say, don't repeat it straight away. Give your child time to process the language, because what can happen is if you repeat it too quickly, they get quite reliant or prompt dependent on that repetition. Whereas if you hang back and give them a good bit of time to process it, and then if not, follow through and use gestures if you need to, point to where you want them to go or what you want them to pick up in the room. So yeah, things like that could be really helpful.
That's really practical and helpful. And I wonder, does that kind of evolve and change as the child gets older? Do you kind of move things forward a little bit in terms of instruction giving, or how does that work?
Absolutely. Yeah. So for example, like by one, children should be able to follow one piece of information, by two pieces of information, three pieces of information. So always start with the easiest and build on that. You want your child to succeed in order for them to be motivated to do more. Things like that. So you might get them to say, okay, let's wash your knees if you're in the bath, or let's eat your peas next. And then you might give them two pieces of information. Okay, let's get the sponge and wash your shoulder, or let's eat one pea and one carrot. So things like that, that you can add on and build onto it. But so yeah, it does grow. And then you're thinking about different concepts as it grows. Can they find things that are big or small? Can they put things that are in, on, and under? So you're looking at prepositions. Can they find things by color or shape? So as they grow, it does get increased. But I always say is make it achievable for them to motivate them to do more. And if you're thinking about, even things like getting your child to get dressed, and I know this is more of an OT perspective, or if you want them to eat their foods, like get them to do the last piece of something so that they get that sense of success or achievement. So if I've got a child with kind of reduced attention and we're doing, say, an inset puzzle, that's a wooden puzzle with the little pegs on the top, I might put all 4 pieces in the puzzle and I'll leave 2 for them to finish. So they get that sense of achievement and success. So similar, like when I'm feeding my son, I'll feed him most of his dinner and I'll leave the last 3 or 4 spoons for him. So always think about getting success for your little one, because that will motivate them to do a little bit more.
Great. And Sarah, can we just touch as well then, we've talked about receptive strategies. What about expressive strategies? And I know this is huge. We're not going to go into AC devices or anything today, but what about simple, again, tips for parents to support their child, to express themselves, to make choices, encourage autonomy at home?
Yeah, so I think, again, simplifying your language and reducing your questions. We already touched on that, but I think it's important to kind of recap on that. Think about where your child's level of language is. So if your child is a gesture user, use lots of gesture too. And if they've got some symbolic sounds, use some symbolic sounds, but add on words too. If your child says a word, you try and add on to that word. I think about language that's motivating for them. So if it's something they're interested in, foods that they like, toys that they like, try and get lots of that information in. Use visuals as much as you can where applicable. Like you said, making a choice is a really big one for little ones, and if they don't have language, they should still be able to access choice in the same way. So having a choice board, or even the two objects of choice. So even simple things like an apple or banana in the morning, or for snack, or choices or t-shirts, or socks. Give your child as much elements of choice in the day. Someone described to me, when children wake up in the morning, their choice battery is empty, and they try and fill it up with as much choices as you can, because when something then is non-negotiable, they're more likely to join in with that. But if they don't get any choice across their day, that's very difficult. And even just showing children the choices, and you can kind of be still in control of that choice, gives them that sense of autonomy, as you said, and allowing them to get involved in things and involved in their everyday activities and routines.
It's just so important for regulation, isn't it? For us
Yes.
all, that we need
Yes.
to feel somewhat in control.
Yeah, of course.
Sarah, your clinic is Play Easy, and you work with individual children and parents. Would you mind talking us through just an example, or someone that comes to mind that you're like, that was a really successful intervention kind of from start to finish, that you kind of supported a family in terms of their communication, just to give us a sense of how you work?
Yeah, of course. And just to say, sorry, the clinic, I've got two companies now, so just so people aren't confused, the clinic is Speakeasy SLT, and Play Easy is the online toy shop. So just that they are two separate. So Speakeasy SLT is the clinic, and I work predominantly with kind of preschool children. I take kids as young as a year, actually, and that's kind of the area that I specialize in. It's really tricky to pick out one in particular, I suppose. The biggest thing for me is I love being a part of families' journeys, and I feel like I really get to, in my job in the private kind of sector, I feel like I really get to build such a rapport with those parents and spend so much time with them, and you really go on a journey with them. Like, I've had kids in my case over 3 and 4 years. There's one particular kid that stands out to me at the moment, and this little girl came to me, and we went on a journey in terms of getting an autistic diagnosis and things like that, and that all came, and we were just on the cusp of those words starting to come. And this little girl got really, really sick, and she was in hospital and ICU for so long. And gosh, I was so worried about her. When she came back to the clinic, I just suggested to mum, about AACs, which is Augmented Interactual Communication. So we used an iPad with a app on it. And sometimes parents are a bit reluctant around the use of AAC because they think that might hinder language or stop language emerging. But this mum was totally open to it, and we got going with it, and she was doing really well with it. And I sent her off on a little break to come back. When she came back, she was speaking in full sentences. So that's a really, really big success story. That always doesn't happen with AAC straight away. It often takes a good bit of nourishment and things like that and modelling. But it's just one that sticks out because, mum was just so open to it, and they feel like they've been on quite a journey already. And obviously with her being so sick in hospital, and then just to hear her voice. And I think that's such a lovely part of the journey with parents, when they do hear their little one's voice, or they start to recognize communication is not just words, and they start to notice that, and they start to really get that interaction going. So yeah, it's really rewarding. I absolutely love my job.
An amazing example, Sarah. And it sounds like you got her just at you introduced it at the right time.
That's it. And I think that's a really key part, isn't it? It's sometimes the timing of it and knowing the little ones, and, as I said, you spend a lot of time with them and figuring it out. And it's not always that, that is, as I said, a real big success story. Sometimes it takes a good bit longer. And I suppose parents come in and you've got to really help them come to that idea, because I always make this analogy that, when you go to the doctor, you get a prescription and you come away and you take your medication and you feel better. And I think when they come into speech and language therapy, and similar to occupational therapy, parents always know what they're coming into, and it's not always that quick fix. And there's a lot of work to do to get there, and a lot of parental involvement. And that's hard. I completely empathize with that as a parent, that, you're busy, you've got other kids in the family, you're working, and you're trying to map this therapy on, and it's not your everyday lingo, and it's not the way you ever thought about things before, and it's our everyday bread and butter. So it does really involve that, really gentle support and guidance, and looking at that individual child to get them to where they need to get to.
Sarah, you mentioned there the reluctance around iPads, and I suspect you might get asked this a lot. There's, in terms of the evidence of the impact of iPads on children, it's still emerging. We're still not sure, what's going on. But in terms of its impact on speech, is there much evidence or research around the impact of using devices for communication with children?
So I think about there's like the iPad, and then there's an iPad with an app for communication on it, if that makes sense. So there's loads of evidence behind the AAC piece, but the uptake of it is quite low, and then I feel that we don't have a huge amount of like specialist support around AAC apps and devices and things like that. But no, there is a lot of evidence for the AAC part. In terms of like iPads and communication, there's emerging evidence, that the impact of devices and TVs and screens and things like that on language development. But as a parent, I always say everything moderation. But I also think then for our neurodivergent children, they need screens. They're learning from screens. They're echolalic. They're picking up language from the screens. They're just not language processors. We know now about how we can map language onto that. So we need to not see that as such a negative thing. And I think we need to think of what works best for the individual family. And I think that's really key. If it's working for this family, we need to meet that family where they're at. It's not about the family comes in, the kids using an iPad all the time, not for communication purposes, but for, interest and engagement and things like that. It's our job to support that child. It's not our job to try and take that away. I think that's a really important piece, It's an individual family situation, and no parent shaming or things like that, because you do see this on Instagram, and I just think, what is the benefit of that? We're all doing our absolute best, and everyone needs to be supported to where they're at.
Sarah, I really like what you're saying about the individualized approach and doing what works for the family. And I guess there's so much information out there on social media and different kind of opinions on what you should do. If somebody is struggling with communication in their family, what should they do, or who should they turn to?
I think, this is an excellent question. And I think, there's a lot of information now that we have access to in social media. And while this brings lots of positives, there's things that people think should be aware of as well. So if you're getting an information and advice around any allied health professionals, we're thinking speech and language therapist, occupational therapist, physiotherapist, dietitian, that they're a core RU registered in Ireland, and I think it's the HCPC in the UK. They're a registered member of that, of their body, because there are people that are maybe have an experience of something, and while their information is really, really helpful, that's just one lived experience. And I suppose as health professionals, we are consulting the evidence base. We are seeing lots of different children all the time. So I think just making sure that you get your information from a good, reputable source. Because while the information can be helpful, it can be overwhelming, and it may not always be completely accurate. And then I think there's a little bit of scaremongering, and then there's lots of other things that come with it. So I suppose just making sure that you're getting your advice and just consulting, and being mindful as well. Like, don't overload yourself with too much information, because I think then you get all this information, but you don't actually know what to do with it. And in terms of speech and language therapy, whenever we're giving suggestions and advice, I always say, take one strategy at a time, apply it before you take on another strategy, because otherwise your interactions with your child are not very fluid. They're kind of disjointed, because you're thinking, was that a question? Was that a comment? Did I pause? So just taking one strategy and just trying to map that into your day. And when you feel comfortable with that, then add in another strategy.
Brilliant.
Really helpful, because I think there's so much shoulds out there, and guilt and shame when you don't get it right, or feeling that there's only one way, and you're letting your child down if you don't have the perfect strategies. So I really like that, simplifying it and personalizing it seems to be important.
And something that I say to parents all the time is, your best is good enough. This is a lot of pressure, but always remember, and you are the expert in your child. So when parents come into the clinic, I might be an expert. I don't like to say that, but you know what I mean? I would always say you're the expert in your child. You know your child best, because that's the biggest thing I hear in the clinic all the time, that parents aren't being listened to. And I think in the, the HSC and things like that, it's just, there's such a demand on the services. It's very difficult for them. And I'm not blaming any individual therapist. I think it's a service level issue. But I always say to parents, tell me, because you're the expert in your child.
Sarah, you're an absolute expert in your field. It has been such a pleasure to learn from you today, and to have such useful, helpful strategies and tips that are going to be invaluable to our listeners. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much for having me. You're so good to ask me. Thank you. I appreciate it.
That's all for today's episode on the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it informative and engaging. If you've any questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at irishotpodcast@gmail.com or connect on Instagram or Facebook.
And remember to subscribe to our podcast so that you never miss an episode. If you found this episode helpful, please leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback is important and helps us to improve the show, so please do leave it. Thank you for listening to the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast, hosted by myself, Jen Trechek.
And myself, Aileen Rutledge.
We look forward to sharing more insights and knowledge with you in future episodes. Until then, take care.